Lee Turner served as the British ambassador to Ukraine from 2008 to 2012 and is the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to Diplomacy. He joins me by Skype from London. Do you see any hope or prospect for negotiations, perhaps not now, but in the next 3 to 6 months?
We've got to recognise that it's very reasonable for any normal person to want to stop war, to stop fighting, to stop killing. So it's understandable everybody's looking for ways to do that. But I have to say, at the moment, it's very hard to see any possible deal that could lead to either a ceasefire or to peace between Russia and Ukraine. If we look at the Ukrainian side, Russia has invaded and occupied something like 18% of the country, killing tens of thousands of troops and displacing millions, causing massive destruction. And Russia has made clear it wants to annihilate Ukraine, that Moscow thinks Ukraine and the Ukrainians have no right to exist. The Ukrainians also know from what happened in 2014 that if Russia stays in control of territory, it will try to keep it forever. We've seen that with these latest 4 areas that Russia is trying to annex. So there's no way that Ukraine can accept that. If we look at the Russian side, it's existential for President Putin as well. He's launched a disastrous, unprovoked war, killing tens of thousands of his own troops, as well as all the destruction on the Ukrainian side, because he's afraid of democracy coming from Ukraine and threatening his own position. Now, if he gives up any of the land his troops have occupied, he's finished. You've just mentioned his demand that the West should recognize these Russian-occupied territories. So I think we're miles from talks. I can't see how the Ukrainians can accept any settlement where Russia gets a lot more territory, and I can't see how President Putin can accept any settlement that doesn't give him that territory.
So does that mean that negotiations are never likely to happen, or are they just years away? Will we just see a frozen conflict because, of course, neither side can accept any change to what has happened now, the votes that have taken place and the territory seized? Ukrainians have said they will never concede any territory to the Russians. That means that negotiations are virtually impossible because they would have to tackle those issues.
I certainly don't see any likelihood of negotiations in the next few weeks, maybe in the months ahead. Much will depend what happens on the battlefield. I think Putin's hope, or the hope of the Russian leadership, is that a long, grinding war will lead to countries that support Ukraine getting, frankly, a bit bored of all this and feeling that this has gone on far too long. And why should they continue to support Ukraine in a war that costs a lot when there's all sorts of problems that countries like Britain and the US have themselves, that maybe voters will think they should be dealing with those problems instead. And we've seen that in the US a bit with the Republican Party saying we can't have blank checks for Ukraine. So that's the hope of Putin. On the other hand, we've also seen that whenever Ukraine reoccupies its territories, where the Russians have pulled back and we see these terrible atrocities that have taken place there, that generates a new wave of sympathy for Ukraine in Western countries. So I would say, unless something changes militarily, we're not going to see any negotiations anytime soon.
And yet it seems as though it's very easy for Russia to every so often push the buttons of Western politicians by speaking about the threat of nuclear war. The two sides have such different attitudes to conflict. Do you think Russia is counting on Western politicians eventually accepting anything to have peace?
I think that any sane person is terrified of the prospect of nuclear war. There is a big question as to whether Russia would actually use nuclear weapons or not. It's been much discussed, very hard to make any firm judgment on that. I think the problem with those who advocate making concessions just in case Russia uses nuclear weapons is that that would mean, first of all, that any time any nuclear country invaded somebody else, you would have to give them whatever they wanted. And secondly, that any use by Russia of nuclear weapons would completely destroy the entire non-proliferation architecture, so that any country anywhere near Russia would want to make sure it acquired its own nuclear weapons, and those nuclear weapons in turn would threaten Moscow. So there are a lot of difficult issues around the use of nuclear weapons by Russia, and I wouldn't take it for granted at all.
What do you think about perhaps some ways in which Russia could potentially retaliate? For example, President Putin now hitting back at these attempts by the international community to cap gains from their oil revenues. He's now signed a decree banning sales under contracts that comply with that price cap. What effect is that likely to have? Because, of course, you know, Western countries can try to slow or make efforts to reduce Russia's revenue streams from energy, but Russia just seems to find new buyers for its products.
Putin is very keen to show that he somehow has the initiative in this. This is why he's making this announcement. Of course, it's a two-edged sword. Every time that Russia says it's going to cut exports of gas, it's said that repeatedly, and indeed we've had this very strange destruction of the North Sea, the Nord Stream pipelines going from Russia to Germany. Every time that Russia has made these threats, the price of gas has gone up and then it's fallen again. And indeed, the price of gas is roughly a third now of where it was last summer. Similarly with oil, as you said, there is this initiative by the G7 and the EU to restrict the cost of oil that Russia can export to $60 a barrel. And this is Putin's response to that. Up to now, over the last 6 months, the price of oil has slid pretty steadily. It's around $80 per barrel compared with $120 in the summer. And as I think your correspondent was saying earlier, the price of oil and gas is notoriously volatile. And we will see over the coming days and weeks whether this threat by Russia will actually make any difference. But up to now, all the things that Putin has done, including the invasion itself, of course, have actually been counterproductive. And I wouldn't take it for granted at all that we will actually see higher oil and gas prices as a result of this latest threat from the Russian president.
All right, thank you very much, Lee Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine.
Thank you.